Slavery is a part of Southern heritage, and on today's Weekly Constitutional, we're learning about a man that led the rebellion.
This has been the summer where we have really revisited in a lot of ways the Confederate history, the Civil War history, for reasons I don't think any of us would wanted to, you know,
Right.
with what happened and the horrible things in Charleston and then the dialogue and discussion that it brought about. Well, Stuart's picking it up as we move on with this week's version of your Weekly Constitutional. Stuart Harris, I'm rude, pardon me. He's the host of the program.
Yeah, you are rude, Josh.
I am
You're
so
terribly
sorry.
rude.
Thank you.
It's all right.
I'm like, you've been here, so they know, and I know you were Stuart Harris,
That's cool,
professor
yeah.
of law
I
at
know.
the Appalachian School of Law in Grundy, Virginia, host of your Weekly Constitutional, heard across the continent.
Indeed it is.
Congratulations
Thank you
on
very
that.
much. Just picked up a station in Alaska. That's pretty cool.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
They're going to learn, as we are later on Sunday afternoon, Tuesday at 8, about Nat Turner.
They are. But before we get to Nat Turner, let's start with a happier topic, shall
Okay.
we? Now,
Shall we?
you've seen, when you were a kid, you saw that Disney movie, Song of the South,
I
didn't
did.
you?
I
And
did.
when you think Song of the South, you think zippity-doo-dah, zippity-yay. Okay, very good. You have a nice voice.
My, oh my,
what a wonderful day.
Unless if you were a slave.
Precisely. That's the point. You know, that was such a marvelous movie, and it's a fond memory for me.
Right.
But it was part of a mythology that grew up after the Civil War that, you know, slavery wasn't so bad.
Yeah.
The slaves were well cared for. Their masters were kind to them. And it was just a nice, slow, pleasant life.
They had no rights, but they were okay with that.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and that's it's an unrealistically benign look at a terrible institution, and so it's an illustration of how things that don't seem bad on the surface can actually mislead us when we try to understand both historical and current events. Slavery was a terrible institution, and slaves, contrary to that mythology, didn't like being slaves. And from time to time, they actually tried to escape, and once or twice at least, there were pretty significant slave rebellions. And perhaps the biggest of those, the most famous, was Nat Turner's rebellion, and that's what we're going to talk about today.
I have to confess, I'm not very familiar with the person of Nat Turner in history.
He is a fascinating character. He was born around 1800. And in 1831, when he was in his early 30s, he was an accomplished young man who could read, which was illegal. He lived in the state of Virginia on a plantation over near the Chesapeake, in the southern part of the coastal part of Virginia, near North Carolina. And he could read, and he was a preacher, and he looked around and he decided he didn't like this slavery thing. And so he led a rebellion. He got together and conspired with some of his friends, and that's where things get very serious, because the very first thing he did was murder the entire family that owned him.
Wow.
Yeah, men, women, children, everybody. It got pretty brutal. And then the slave rebellion moved from plantation to plantation and murdered more and more people. That got the slave owners' attention. That got the wider society's attention. The militia was called in, and within a few days there was a pitched battle where ultimately the rebellion was put down. Nat Turner escaped for about 6 weeks. They eventually hunted him down. Then there were a series of trials. There were a series of accounts that were written about this, and ultimately the rebellious slaves were all executed and the rest were returned to slavery. But it had all sorts of repercussions in the South. It was about 30 years before the Civil War, and it led to all sorts of a backlash and all sorts of pretty unpleasant things happening between then and the Civil War.
130 years later, Dr. King comes along with a very different message.
Very different message.
That this is not how you gain freedom and rights in this country.
No, there was a terrible violent thing, violence on both sides of that issue, but I think that that's the lesson. This was an inherently violent institution. When you put people down that way, things like this will happen. And it was a terrible, terrible incident, and I think we all need to know more about it.
I agree, and I'm glad you're helping to teach us about it.
Well, thank you.
It's going to be a program you'll hear Sunday at 3, then Tuesday at 8, your Weekly Constitutional on WETS FM, public radio out of ETSU in Johnson City. Stuart, thanks.
Thanks very much, Josh.